grow as a result. And so I wanted something that had that finesse worm versatility and feel, but in a bigger profile, and something that still had very bite getting intentionality, but also had the features that are required for driving big largemouth to committing. And that was something that, we really tried to work on with this worm, and I feel like we did a very good job on.
So yeah, working with you on this project, you're very intentional. Anyone who's met you or heard you talk on live or just in general about fishing knows you're very intentional. And a lot of that is because you have tools in your boat that allow you to have data that you never had before in, whether that forward-facing sonar has allowed you as an angler to really maximize what gets bites in certain scenarios and what features in certain baits, playing with all those baits, playing with the thousands of dollars in tackle, you put all that information into this worm. And that's what struck me was when we started working on this is every little thing about this bait is intentional. So just, for those, again, this is an ICAST release. We barely have any. You had a few of the prototypes in your hand that we'll see at ICAST. So, really the world is just being introduced to this bait. Describe the bait, everything about the bait, what makes it different, why you did all the little things, whether it be the drop down or the length or everything.
Yeah, man. So with this bait, we tried to be really intentional in every aspect from start to finish, from the head of the worm to the tail, about making sure that every minute detail both, increased your odds of catching more and bigger fish. With big bite baits, I mean, that's one of our emphasis, even in the name of the company, is we're trying to generate as many big bites as we can. I mean, it's important in 5-fish format and in our every fish counts format. And so first and foremost, I mean, we want to make your bait that wants to get bit. But I also wanted to make sure that so many of the features on this bait would complement each other, because a lot of times in bait design and in products, you see products where, certain features of the bait clash with other features of the bait. So let's, for example, let's talk about like with crankbaits. If you have a crankbait that is, completely chartreuse or a very bold red crankbait, but you make it entirely silent and you're emphatic that silent is what matters in this bait and not rattles, but you're choosing a color that is so absolutely outlandish that it's unlike anything they eat, you're choosing to be scrutinous about one thing, but you're not being scrutinous about another unnatural thing. And so you're choosing two totally different options at once. And that's something that, is really not choosing to fish with intentionality. And so with this worm, I wanted to have, features that could both attract an above average size bite and generate bites from big ones, but still have enough finessey features that make it, those finesse worm category of baits so effective, in every situation. And that was, really one of the biggest challenges was creating something that could play between both worlds and have features that didn't clash. And really the biggest way that you can do that with finesse worm specifically is with the size of the profile. So the initial size of the profile is what draws the attention of so many above average size fish. That profile size and form, in terms of, the width of the bait or the length is what draws that initial reaction. So, a lot of finesse worms, and we've got plenty of good finesse worm options in these size ranges. The big bite baits, we've got, the 6-inch finesse worm, 8-inch finesse worm, which are kind of complementary baits, both up and down of this Nekorama worm. That 8-inch is a truly magnum finesse worm. Like it is a big, lead shaky head, Carolina rig, aggressive, big, like war fishing for a school of 6-pounders on a ledge at Toledo Bend type worm. And that 6-inch worm is much more of your traditional finesse worm that you're going to throw on a floating worm or throw on a drop shot or a smaller shaky head or something like that. But this 7-inch worm both has a big enough profile to draw those above average class of fish, but it still has, so we put very fine ribbing in this bait. It's almost like the trick stick in the ribbing. It's very fine and narrow, which is something that I really like, because that fine ribbing allows, the water displacement as you move that bait through the water to consistently move across the bait in the same way every time. Because you have those grooves, you have it all the way up the worm from the head to the tail. which allows that bait to act in a consistent manner. And I always want consistent action out of a bait. I don't want a bait to move unpredictably. I want it to move the same way every single time to where I can control the experiment. We also put one big thing with this bait in terms of intentionality for the name Nekorama was we made the nose a little bit more blunt on this bait to be able to take bigger weights effectively, because there are times where we need to fish this bait either really fast or deep, especially fishing for spotted bass and smallmouth on reservoirs like Cumberland, Cherokee, Hartwell, Lanier, Chateau, like all of your herring lakes in conjunction with a lot of your highland reservoir lakes with smallmouth in them. This can be a deadly technique, but a lot of times you want to be a little bit faster with it. So we made that head a little bit more enlarged, take bigger weights more effectively. And we also added divots above and below the egg sac portion on this worm to where, for those of you that like to run an O-ring, just to be more efficient and to, not have to be changing and manipulating your worm as much, there's a divot that'll keep your ring recessed to where it's not as easy to pull that ring loose with the hook, because having a ring is a great thing, but if you don't have the ability to recess it, you're going to pull it out. And as soon as you pull that ring off the worm, as soon as your hook pops out of that worm, you're going to pull the ring off the bait. And so that was something we wanted to put in this bait for sure. But that profile, a big thing with it as well is, if you look at the bait, the tail is much more enlarged than the portion between the tail and the body, which is extremely important in finesse worm presentations, because that tail being heavier and displacing more water than the mid portion is extremely important for allowing that bait. So with a Nico rig, what I want is, if I rig it properly and have the proper weight in it, when I pull it, it should vibrate. It should buzz a little bit. You should be able to feel that. And you can't do that without having an enlarged tail portion, or a tail portion that catches more water and displaces more water. So we did that with this worm. But another thing is, like, when we were working on this worm and looking at the size and the proportions of it and making sure it displaced water and all those things, those are all kind of characteristics that are built around having a bigger profile and a bulkier profile. But a lot of us know, like, when we want to throw like a drop shot or a shaky head, for example, or a presentation where a lot of people will texpose this bait and put a hook inside the bait, so say the worm's rigged like this and they have their hook rigged like this with the hook point coming back in. Any sort of rigging where the bait's going to have to fold down and get out of the way for a hook set. I liked, we put a little bit of a slightly concave back to this worm, which is both a way to reduce a little bit of weight on the backside in terms of keeping the weight up front and making that, reaction very aggressive, making it simple to know how to rig the worm the same every single time, because there is a front and there is a back. And so it keeps it consistent in that manner. But it also folds down really well and gets out of the way when you need to set the hook, which, especially with a drop shot and smaller hooks like that can be a big issue with the finesse worm. Is a lot of times you don't lose fish on those techniques, but you will miss them initially if that bait's not capable of getting out of the way. So that that slightly concave back allows that worm to fold down and get out of the way to where you can have more consistent hook sets, drive a hook a little bit easier on, spinning rod techniques and things like that, which was something I wanted to see out of it. But, really with finesse techniques like this, another important factor is keeping it as, in my opinion, as non-intrusive as possible when it comes to some of the features on the bait. And so we chose to go with matte colors on this bait. Matte colors, in my opinion, are one of the most ultimate ways to separate your bait from the thousands of other soft plastic baits that fish have seen in most of these fisheries. And another thing is, these matte colors allow this bait to be far more subtle in its environment, because it's not constantly throwing flash from a gloss sheen that's on the bait. And for me, at least, that's something I really like, even to the point of taking gloss baits and like rubbing them across the carpet to try and knock some of the gloss off it. So that's the issue you don't have with this bait. This bait is, fantastic in terms of the color selection. I think we've got a fantastic run of colors coming out, and a lot of them look really, really sick. So I'm excited about that for sure. But man, this bait has so many intentional features driven into it to make sure that this is not just another finesse worm. There's obviously hundreds and hundreds of options on the market for finesse worms in size and color and from all sorts of different directions of the way that you can approach a finesse worm, a straight tail worm. And I, you know, for me as an angler, one thing I live by is I don't do anything for no reason. If I don't have a reason, I need to find a reason and then take that reason and apply it by making a decision related to it. And I took the same approach into this worm. I did not, we didn't want to put any features into this bait that were just nonchalant, or we just did it because, who cares? Every single little part about this worm was done intentionally to both work together within the bait itself and to, promote whatever technique somebody wanted to fish this bait on. Although my preference for it, I mean, I'm a big Nico rig guy. It's kind of, my starting point with finesse worm techniques, but it's got so many features wrapped up in it that it's extremely capable, and in our case last week, extremely powerful on other techniques as well.
So yeah, let's talk about that for a second. Just the, how you rig this bait for Nico rigging, and then how you might use it for, say, a drop shot, and when you pick between the two. Because last week on Chowan, it was all about a drop shot, and those are two. It's again a similar profile worm. In this case, it's the exact same profile worm. You're using the same worm for both techniques. So how do you choose one over another in a given scenario?
Sure. So really, the first question you have to ask yourself a lot of times when you're trying to choose what finesse worm technique you want to go with is, do I want, are most of my fish primarily feeding up on this bait? If I'm using forward facing sonar, it's very easy to tell, watching how they come up, whether they come up and catch it or whether they don't. And if I'm not using forward facing sonar, noticing whether when I make my cast, if most of my bites are coming initially when I flip my bail and get my line tight, or if it's, when I throw it out there and I drag it a little bit and then I finally get a bite. And so I'm trying to ascertain whether I want them to feed up or feed down, which is going to be a big part of my selection. So I'm only ever going to pick up a shaky head intentionally when they're feeding down. That bait is at its very best when it's on the bottom and manipulating a lot of times a hard cover environment, but on the bottom and keeping that bottom contact versus like a drop shot. I'm only going to lean to a drop shot when I know for a fact that they don't want to feed on the bottom. Although they might want to feed near the bottom, they don't want to feed on the bottom. But that Nico rig is so powerful, in my opinion, and is the reason I pick it first most of the time, if I can get away with it, is that Nico rig is both effective at catching fish that want to come up and eat it and catching fish that want to go down and eat it. Because although there's going to be a majority population on your fishery at any given time, it's not always 100%. And so I don't just want to catch 90% of what I'm trying to catch. I want to catch 100%. And that Nico rig, I can catch ones that want to feed up and fish that want to feed down and treat it like a shaky head. And unlike a shaky head, whenever I pull that Nico rig tight, it doesn't pull it by the head, which is, the head's the tie point for a shaky head, which means you're going to kind of pull it up and it's going to move in a snake-like motion and then hop back down again. That Nico rig, it's standing like this and my tie point's here. And when I go to pull it tight, all it's going to do is it's going to fold back a little bit and then it's going to stand up again. It's not going to have a really aggressive posture change like a shaky head does, which is one major benefit of a Nico rig. And, another very major benefit of it is as soon as I get my line tight, that bait a lot of times is going to semi-hold its place in the water column. So through the pressure of the water against it as I'm holding my line tight, keeping it from moving too far forward, and my line being tight, keeping it from falling at too high of a rate of speed, I can at least semi-suspend it when I need it to, which makes it very effective at catching fish that aren't exactly related just to the bottom. But the one place that the Nico rig does tend to fall short a little bit is oftentimes in siltier bottom or around cover. And around cover, it's just because you can rig a Nico rig weedless. But the only issue with rigging it weedless is oftentimes your hookup ratio does go down. It's just kind of a natural fact of using very small hooks with a soft plastic bait. You're going to miss some fish, which is an unfortunate consequence of it. And as a result, if I've ascertained that I can catch them not directly on the bottom, and throw a technique that keeps it away from the silt on a silty fishery, a lot of times I'm going to lean for a drop shot. It's been very effective for me on the Harris chain, I've caught them on multiple tidal fisheries now. I've caught them, I guess, not just Harris Chain, but Florida in general. Multiple tidal fisheries, up shallow on more of your dirt hole mud fisheries as well. But that drop shot is extremely powerful in siltier, snaggier places, and that's kind of what we got into at the Chowan last week. And that was a big reason for my selection there. But that drop shot is extremely powerful when you're, like I said, in snaggier type scenarios, and when you're trying to catch them near the bottom but not on it. And that was where we were kind of sitting at the Chowan. But understanding the reasons why you're taking your approach to finesse fishing the way you are is one of the biggest things in fishing, is understanding the why of why you're doing what you're doing. It allows you to make the right decisions as to what techniques to lean towards. But as far as that goes, probably need to get into the nitty gritty of exactly how I approach rigging the worm. In this case, the Big Bite Baits Nekorama worm on these different techniques. So for me, when I'm approaching this Nico rig setup, first off, I like a straight shank Nico hook. A lot of people like, a standard like wide gap wacky style hook or something like that, which is definitely a quality option. It's still going to be sticky. You're still going to land a lot of fish. The only issue with the standard wide gap option is that you've got a quite a bit shorter shank on that. So, you're working with maybe half an inch of shank. And a lot of times that worm wants to fold over the hook and catch on the point. That is the only time you ever lose fish on a Nico rig for the most part, is whenever that worm folds over and catches the point. And so I like a straight shank hook because you got more shank to work with to keep the back end of that worm from folding over the hook. And with a Nico, one of the interesting things about the way I fish it, which is kind of contrary to most, is that worm. So if my elbow in this scenario is the head of the worm and my hand is the tail of the worm, I rig my hook when I'm fishing this technique with the shank here and the point below the shank. So this is something that, in at first glance, people are like, how do you ever hook a fish?
That's what I thought at first. So this is for example, here's an early prototype of the worm. Your hook point, if it's the end of my finger, you have it facing down, which is very different from most people.
So it's actually, I got to give him credit. It's one of my buddy's ideas that he had tried out. And that shank of that hook, especially with a longer straight shank hook, is going to protect that hook point from the worm folding over on it as easily, which is a really big thing for getting that 1 in 20 bites that you miss because that worm folds over on the hook point. And, it's something that I definitely abide by very heavily when I'm fishing this Nico rig presentation, because the other thing is the fish is not swimming up to that bait and trying to ascertain exactly how you want him to eat it. He's just swimming up and eating it. And as soon as he does, that worm's getting all folded, discombobulated in their mouth. It's not like, up is not up and down is not down at that point. They eat that worm and now it's totally misshapen. Their crushers are trying to pull it down and things of that nature. And so it's not like, if you pay attention with a Nico rig, hook it whichever way you want to hook it and hook as many fish as you want. And you will never see any extreme consistency as to where that hook point is falling inside that fish's mouth. Although most of the time it's going to fall toward the roof of their mouth, that's just because of the fact that your line pressure is pulling it upwards. That's the only reason you see it majority fall into the top of their mouth. It's just because of the direction your pressure is pulling it. But ultimately, where that hook point faces is not determining where that fish gets hooked in the mouth. But the other thing with that rig is with the weight selection. I start out generally around 16th. There are times that I go lighter, especially when I'm trying to get them to feed up. So when I'm using it almost as a guided wacky rig, fishing for, a lot of times fish around shallow cover, especially in the springtime. This is a big springtime thing. It's like in the spring, I like lightweight Nico rigs versus as we get into the summer, especially into the fall, I'll go up to an 8th. There have been times where I go as heavy as a 3/16 on a Nico rig, which is something that, not a lot of people do, but it can be really effective in the fall fishing for pressured fish and fish that are very intelligent, to kind of catch them off guard with a very aggressive and snappy Nico presentation. But I kind of start at that 16th mark, and I'm willing to go up or down if need be, but that's my starting point. And with that Nico, if you need to buy yourself the ability to throw the bait further, because it's generally pretty light, without it having to go way up in weight, or sorry, without increasing your rate of fall really aggressively because of that increase in weight, something that I'll do is I will far upsize the diameter of my leader, or even at times, for those of you that want to or have familiarity with it, if you want to go with mono, it absolutely works with mono, is upsize your line diameter to where you get some line drag, to where you can upsize the weight of your worm and still throw it that distance you want to throw it to make long casts. But you make that rate of fall, instead of being like an eighth, make it more like a 16th again, because of upsizing your line diameter. And playing little tricks like that is a very unique way to get more out of your presentation. It's something that I definitely play on a lot when I need to. But that's kind of the Nico angle on that. So I'm going to take a second and take a breath. And I mean, Jack's always got something beneficial to bring to the conversation, so I want to give you the chance to do so.
Well, I just love picking your brain about all of it. Certainly, I've caught plenty on a Nico, nowhere near as many as you have, but it's like, so the little things like, yeah, I've certainly had plenty of times where you go to set the hook on a fish, you come back, you go, dang it, how did he miss it? And the hook's, the worm's all balled up on the hook, and it's a terrible feeling. So those little tricks are things that, really any fisherman can use to get a few more bites. So when you're using that straight shank hook, what size are you using on a bait like this 7-inch Nekorama?
So with this bait, I mean, it is forgiving. You can use a wide range of hook sizes. One of our guys with GSM is that I'm pretty close with is Marshall Robinson. Marshall uses a 2-aught size hook with this presentation. He uses a very large hook versus I use a size 1 or size 2, which is, it's on the other side of the spectrum. It's a little bit small. But I'm going to fall in that size 1 to even up to 1-aught category. That is kind of where I like to fall. I'm going to start at that size 1, and if I'm dealing with excessively large fish, or I'm dealing with places where I need a little bit more, a little bit heavier gauge hook to drag them out of cover, from around cover, I'll lean to that 1-aught a little bit. But that's where I'm falling most of the time. I don't really feel like there's a significant reason to go bigger than that or smaller than that most of the time. So that's kind of where I'm falling.
Okay, so then when you're putting your hook in this worm, now again, this is like a 3D print that we went through. This isn't even the final one, but just for visually, you talked about those O-ring slots earlier, and majority of anglers that are using a Nico rig, they're going to use an O-ring, so they make their worm last longer because it just holds the worm from all sides rather than your hook point pulling it out. But so we have 2 indentions on this worm. There'll be one above the egg sac and below it. So like for an angler who doesn't fish a Nico rig, where are they supposed to hook this thing? Or, you hook it down near the head, in the middle. A traditional wacky Cinco, a lot of times you're thinking the dead middle, but you got different options with this worm. Where should someone start?
So the starting point with this worm, in my opinion, when you're looking at the profile of the Nekorama worm, there's going to be that slick spot, that egg sac portion. Generally, I'm going to put the hook point in the slick spot, and it's going to come out underneath that first ring. Is generally where I'm going to start. But there's 2 purposes with this presentation in terms of how you're wanting to fish it. So if you're wanting to cover water and you're wanting to be a little bit more efficient and kind of be snappy with it, I'm going to rig that hook point lower and lower depending on how much faster I'm wanting to fish this bait. Versus if I'm wanting to throw the Nico rig and make a cast and keep it in one spot for a decent portion of time and maximize the action that I can get out of the bait, I will slide my hook point further up on the worm toward the tail, to where whenever I'm working that bait on the bottom, I'm doing less movement of the head toward me, which is where the majority of that weight is, but I'm actually manipulating the tail primarily and doing less movement of the head towards my bow, so I can keep the bait in one place easier while still getting even more action out of it than I would rigging it lower.
So do you start with one and move to another, or when do you choose one over another?
The portion that I explained there, in terms of where I start, is my starting point for sure, and it's probably where I fall 75% of the time. I'd say that remaining 25% of the time, about 12.5% of that time, I'm rigging it below that point, trying to be efficient to where whenever I kick my handle, that bait does a little bit more pop up and toward me when I want to be fast with it. And then when I stop it, it's going to take that straight up and down presentation again really fast. Um, and then when I rig it higher than that is generally when I'm target fishing, especially when I'm target fishing deep. So like when I want to make a specific cast at one thing, let's say, for example, let's say you're on Sam Rayburn, you've got a little hard spot and it's like 4 feet wide and it's got 6 that are between 5 and 8 pounds on it. And I know that if I pull them off this spot, I'm not going to get them to bite. That's when I'm going to rig it a little bit higher on the worm, make that cast at that spot, and I'm just going to hang it in one place and just bump my slack. But having that hook higher on the worm just moves the tail far more than it moves the bait itself. And so it keeps the bait in one place, but you can still create a lot of action as a result.
And then, so let's go back to because I feel like you kind of took the size weights that we use in a Nico rig, and you went to the second class. If I'm in beginner class, when it comes to size of weights, generally, the general adage is, hey, deeper water, I'm going to use a heavier weight, but that's not always the case for you. So explain, again, when you show up on a place like Chowan River, show up on a place like Sam Rayburn, what is it that makes you pick one? Is it primarily depth still, or when do you start to play with different weights in the same depth range?
I mean, so in this scenario, we're going to say all other things held constant. We're not fishing in 40-mile-an-hour wind. We're not fishing for fish that are swimming 3 miles an hour. We're talking about a motionless fish in non-windy conditions. I'm going to pick my weight size purely based on how fast and aggressive I want to fish the bait. So if I'm wanting to be really snappy with it and snap, snap, snap and drop, or if I'm wanting to reel it hard and then kill it, I'm gonna go heavier. And if I'm wanting to just throw it and drag it, or throw it out there and give it, a pull and let it sink, and pull and let it sink, and almost fish it like a deep wacky worm, that's when I'm gonna go with a lighter weight. My weight selection is very primarily based on speed. It's not based on depth primarily. That being said, the deeper you go, obviously, that you are going to have to get a little bit heavier to be any kind of efficient with it. But primarily, let's say shallower than 20 feet, my decision making is entirely based on what speed I want to fish this technique, not how deep I'm fishing it. So if you want to fish it fast and be efficient, go up and weight. If you want to take your time and try and maximize bites, go down and weight.
So then, for an angler who's just getting started with a Nico rig, they show up to their lake, they've got a number of nail weights in their box. They've got a 16th. They've got, maybe a 32nd, a light one. They've got several different sizes. On a given day, how do they know when they want to go fast, should go fast, or go slow with it? How do they know where to start? Because you've learned that over, a lot of fishing experience. For someone who doesn't know, what are they looking for?
A good rule of thumb, the more target oriented they are, and the more the cooler the water, the more likely I am to go with that lighter weight. And the more that they are in extremely warm water or roaming around, the more likely I am to go with a heavier weight. That's just kind of where I start. But I'm going to start almost always, I'm going to start with that 16th, and I will gauge their reaction and go up or down from there. But that 16th, if you're looking for one, like let's say you're preparing for your tournament and you're tying stuff on in your garage and you don't have the luxury of knowing what direction you should go from the get-go, start at 16th and then work up or down from there.
Perfect. So if someone wanted a 16th ounce nail weight, Nekorama, what color if you had to pick one to start? Or how do you select colors?
If you've got to have one color of this bait for this technique, just one, you got to start with green pumpkin. That being said, you've got, with this bait, we're going to have a couple options. We got a green pumpkin with a flake, which is a more traditional green pumpkin. And then we have a green pumpkin color that has absolutely no flake. It's just color. And for me personally, that would be my direction that I would go. I feel very strongly about that bait. It's a color that we talked about a lot going into it, just because, it's kind of the why, where's the need? But for me, the flake in that bait is kind of what gives it definition or gives it shape to a fish in the water. Sorry, having that flake as a reference point gives a bait depth and it makes it discernible. And when you take that flake out, you make that bait semi-indiscernible, and it becomes more of an amorphous shape of color, more than it is a physical object that they can pick apart. And so I would go with a straight green, that green pumpkin with no flake, and that would be my starting point for sure. Because regardless of the water clarity, regardless of the fishery, north, south, east, west, a green worm is going to get bit.
Perfect. So, and then, let's go back to the Chowan. Of course you had to like take it a Nico rig worm. And of course the first exposure it gets to the world is that it's on a drop shot. You had to throw it on a drop shot just to make me feel dumb for making it a Nico worm. But that's, a straight toe worm. The properties that made it special on a Nico rig, you believe were more useful on the Chowan as a drop shot. So again, when do you choose a Nico versus a drop shot? You talked about, whether they're feeding on the bottom or not. So what was it about the Chowan that made you say, I have to throw this on a drop shot? And what's your tackle like when you're picking a drop shot rig?
So the Chowan, I ended up leaning to the drop shot because of, the snaggy nature of the fishery. There's thousands and thousands of stumps and sticks and little pieces of cover on the bottom to get hung on, which is why, I went to a drop shot that was text pose. I didn't have it nose hooked to where I could keep the hook point protected by the worm easily without sacrificing hookup ratio. And the other thing with this is the drop shot. The one thing that the drop shot has is the ability to kind of make it foolproof regardless of the conditions, to where the big thing with it is to make the cast and hit the fish. If you can hit your target with a drop shot, that drop shot's going to do most of what you need it to do for you, and that fish will interact with it and eat it on its own accord. You're not the one manipulating it up or down, shaking it in place, deciding when to go and stop. That drop shot, if there's one there that's willing to eat it, all you got to do is hit him. And we had some very windy conditions the last day of this tournament. It made it where it was pretty inefficient to try and throw a technique that, required a little bit more attention, to detail. And the other thing is that Nico rig, when you want to throw a lighter weight in a snaggier, shallower situation like we were on Chowan, you're not going to be able to do that very effectively in the wind. And so the drop shot was an efficiency decision for me, just as much as it was a cover related decision. And the last part of it is on a lot of your southern fisheries or your tidal fisheries too. For whatever reason, I think it's the presence of silt in the fishery on a lot of those places, but they don't like to feed directly off the bottom that much. And if they're not trying to specifically feed off the bottom, but they want to be near the bottom, that's when I go with that drop shot. And so that's what I ended up doing. Took that drop shot, 1/8 ounce weight. I had about 1.5 leader on this drop shot. So it wasn't super long, it wasn't super short. It's pretty standard. And I had that same size 1 hook that I've been using in the Nico rig is the same hook I use in the drop shot. And that was the direction I went with that bait. I was throwing our green worm and until I burned through all of them, because those Chowan River bass were just absolutely annihilating it. That was my go-to this week with the Chowan, and that bait, the action on the drop shot is absolutely fantastic. I can pitch that bait up there and with basically no effort whatsoever. So much of that bait is free to move, and so much of the weight when you text pose it on that drop shot falls behind the hook, so it's allowed to manipulate the rig as much as it needs to generate that action. So
perfect. Well, we're gonna, I think that's a bunch of questions that I have, but I know that people watching in the audience have got some questions. So I'm gonna go through and look through some of the questions we've had so far. And if anybody watching live, if you've got a question for Drew about, anything Nico rig, anything drop shot, anything bass fishing, I'm sure he'd be more than happy to answer. I've got a question here from Cole Boyd. He asks, do you ever use the nail weights that have a jig skirt threaded through them?
So I have used those before. It's a very interesting concept. It's bass fishing. I can't necessarily say that it's never going to be an effective decision. But I've kind of found it like when I'm leaning toward a finesse worm presentation, a lot of times the reason that I'm leaning to that presentation is simplicity and effectiveness. And with a Nico rig, one of the things that makes it extremely effective is that you can be very quick with it. You know, you throw it, it slides through the water very effectively, even with a very light weight. And it's very slick. Like it doesn't have a lot of resistance in the water and things of that nature. And the other thing is it's very it's very simple. The simplicity of that worm is one of the most powerful things, is that it's not trying to do too much. It's just a very effective presentation because of that. You know, we've talked about this many times. A straight tail worm is one of the most unappealing baits in terms of how our eyes see aesthetics of action and things like that. But a straight tail worm is arguably the most powerful soft plastic ever made. Um, and so, like with this technique, I'm not necessarily trying to do too much. So I do not lean to that skirted option. However, I can't say that it's never caught a bass, and I can't say that it's ever necessarily a terrible idea. But I never lean to it just because of the reasons that I choose to use this technique. Lend to simplicity and lend to trying to maximize my effectiveness and efficiency.
Nice. Our own Brandon, he wants to know, he's tuning in. He wants to know, when if green pumpkin's your go-to, when are you going to another color? When are you going to a morning dawn or a red bug or a June bug?
For sure. So when I'm, you know, I green pumpkin is my starting point most of the time. But there are times where I'll pick up a different color. You know, I even did when we were at the Chowan last week. So whenever we start seeing some changes in either forage or some severe watercolor changes, meaning extremely dirty water and very tannic water. Those are two times where I will change a color because of the way that those water tints change the way that colors look underwater, and change the way that, you know, the boldness or the hardness of the color in terms of the way that they perceive it in their environment. And so when I'm talking about like a forage type change, so let's say you're fishing up north and you're fishing around a fishery that has lots of, it's primarily a perch fishery. I'm going to really lean heavily on green and like light grays and tan colors, and I'm going to primarily try and play to that angle. Or like a goby fishery, I'm going to lean to those deep browns and even into the starting to get into the purple hues and things like that. Versus, you know, if I'm fishing a fishery that's got a lot of shad in it, I'm gonna lean a lot lighter on my color selection, or something that's got a white sheen or a gray sheen to it, that is going to be a little bit more, even though the bait itself is not very heavily resembling the forage they're eating, at least the colors will fall in that category that they're familiar with. And then the other thing is, you know, if I get in really dirty water, really off color water, where I feel like I have to maximize visibility as much as possible, that's the times I'm going to lean on the darker colors, your June bugs, your red bugs, your morning dawn colors, even your more reddish and purplish colors. And then in tannic water, man, I don't know what it is about tannic water, but it really seems to lend well to me, especially to the like pink and light purple hues. Those very much produce for me in tannic water. I don't know what it is about that tint that changes the way that those bass see that bait and the way that they respond to it. But I get a little bit more drawing power out of those colors, in more tannic water. And as a result, when you get more drawing power out of fish, and if you're fishing for fish that are in groups, more drawing power equals more bites. Not necessarily because you're drawing fish from other places, but because you're drawing the entire group to an object because they're all very aware of its presence. And so, you know, that's why people saw me pick it up with Chowan last week was because of that extremely tannic water. It's just something that I have a lot of confidence in, and that I've seen truly does make somewhat of a difference in terms of drawing power. And so that's kind of my color selection thing. But man, if you have, you know, really, we've got a lot of great colors in this for a lot of different, regions of the country and people's needs in terms of what they want out of this technique. But for you as a person, you're probably going to need, 4 or 5 colors that you're really set on in terms of their effectiveness. Because one, I like having a lot of options. Don't get me wrong, but whenever I have a need, whether I need a natural color or whether I need a specifically want something in the greenish browns, or I want a purple or red, or I want a pink, whatever I need, I'm going to pick one color in that category to fulfill that role in terms of like I said, very dirty water, tidal, certain types of forage, whatever. And I'm going to really make sure that I have an appropriate quantity of the bait that I need in those colors, rather than trying to have 14 colors, but I don't have enough packs of what I need. And so then I have to switch colors because I haven't supplied myself efficiently. So like in my boat, if you go through my finesse worm selection, you're probably only going to find about 4 colors, but you're going to find an absolute ton of packs of those worms in those colors, because I know that when I get in that scenario, I'm gonna lock into one color and I'm gonna burn through. So that's kind of my approach to color for sure.
Nice. We got another question. It says, Drew, can you share some advice for someone who's just starting out?
Yeah, man. If you're just starting out, one of the biggest things you can do is a lot of people say it, but keep it simple in terms of your tackle selection. And when I say keep it simple, I don't mean I like to throw a jig, so I'm going to buy jigs, and that's all I'm going to buy. What I'm saying is, if you're going to go into, stepping into fishing, whether it's fishing ponds, lakes, or tournament fishing, keep it simple. Buy a couple different baits from each category of what you're looking to try and learn. Don't try and, let's say you're getting into jerkbait fishing, for example. Before you understand jerkbait fishing and understand the process of when to throw a jerkbait, under what scenario to throw a jerkbait, what colors you need in certain situations, before you know all those things, don't go buying every single color of Scope Stick 100 and every single color of Scope Stick 120 and every size and the floating model and the spinning model and sinking model and all that before you understand the process of using those techniques. Buy one of each kind of, so let's say a jerkbait, for example, buy a sinking one, buy a floating one, buy a suspending one of a very, for me, it's a Pro Blue is one that I lean on a lot. Buy a Pro Blue of those 3 and learn in what scenarios each of those play, and then start filling in your selection from there. But keep it simple. Get a lot of different types of tackle and techniques when you're trying to learn and expand, but don't try and attack the niche until you understand the presentations and the techniques as a whole first. Would be something that, as getting into it, man, one of the biggest things when we're getting into it that we focus on is like, how much money do I want to invest into this? And how do I want to allocate those resources? I mean, I was doing this in high school when I was, on a pretty tight budget for tackle selection. And, that's one of the best ways to do it is to diversify early, but not do it in a very niche way and trying to, attack every nuance. Get something that fulfills a need in a bunch of different categories. And then as you learn those techniques, then decide from there, oh, I think this color might be a little bit better actually, or I think this, this type of profile might be a little better. I actually think I might prefer sinking for my fisheries over suspending or whatever, what have you. Go into it, trying to learn the presentation in general, and then get more specific as time goes on and as you invest more into it. But originally, just keep it simple, learn the techniques, and then from there, make your decisions on what you want to really refine.
Nice. Well, and we're wrapping up here. I don't want to keep you too much longer because I know you've got some bass to be catching out on Champlain. And if I were you, I'd be wanting to get to them as fast as I could, because that's an amazing place. Amazing,
yeah, it's a cool place.
Cool. But there's one last question here. If what would you be doing if it weren't professionally fishing? If you weren't professionally fishing, could you even imagine doing anything else?
Dude, like that was the question. I mean, in college, like that's question numero uno most of the time is like, I'm going to get this degree. What on earth am I going to do with it? And I I was getting my business marketing degree um, before the whole fishing thing took off. Um, but man, I don't really know necessarily what I'd be doing. I was hoping that I would land inside the industry in some way, shape, or form because I'm really passionate about not just competing, but catching bass. I love reeling in bass, and I love helping other people do it too because it's a joy that I have, and I feel like that everybody that gets to experience it, at least in some way, will share in that joy with me, and that's something that I really, matters a lot to me. So I knew I wanted to be part of the industry in some way, shape, or form. But if it wasn't professionally fishing, I'm sure I would be involved in the process of helping people catch more bass. But it would probably look a little bit different. It might be on the sales side or a marketing standpoint or something of that nature. But man, I've definitely got a heart for this industry and the sport because this. I mean, is there's not many things that you can do in life that are quite as satisfying as reeling in bass. And that's something that I'm definitely passionate about and something that would have been a part of my work in a way, shape, or form. But thankfully it's worked out the way it has, and I get to reel them in for a living. So
Yeah, and I think you're going to be doing it for a little while. So if people want to follow along with you and learn more, and I know you're always sharing more like what you're learning on the water, you're sharing with people who ask, whether it be on Instagram, Facebook. Where can people follow you if they want to ask you and pick your brain more about bass fishing?
So anywhere you want to find me or need to find me for learning how to catch more bass and keeping up with everything we do on tour, you can find me at Gill Fishing on almost all of those platforms. I've got stuff on, I'm very constant on Instagram and Facebook. I'm also on Twitter, or I guess X, and YouTube as well. But those are a little bit more sporadic for me right now. But Instagram and Facebook, I can always be found at Gill Fishing, and I put out a pretty steady stream of content as far as that goes. So if you want to keep up with me on tour, or just keep up with what I'm doing to try and catch some more bass, those are the best places to find me. And if anyone wants to reach out, or is just curious about how I, specifically to this conversation, what I do with those finesse worm techniques or anything else that's catching bass related, I am always more than happy to have a conversation about reeling them in. Something I always enjoy. So if you ever need anything, feel free to reach out to those directions. But it's been a great time, Jack, and I really appreciate you having me on. Getting to talk bassing with you is always a pleasure, whether we're on camera or not. And I've definitely had a good time.
Yeah, thank you, Drew. And I'll let you get your bass and beauty rest so you can go reel in a few smallmouth for me tomorrow. But thank you guys for watching. And until next time, follow us at Big Bite Baits and Drew on all those platforms.